Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Toronto General and Western Hospital Foundation virtual Q&A. I'm Christian Cote, host of the UHN podcast Behind the Breakthrough. We're glad you could join us and grateful to you, our family of supporters who've been so generous throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So a big thank you on behalf of the foundation and all of UHN. Today, we're turning the spotlight to UHN research, planning for the resumption of surgeries and procedures, and the latest on infection prevention and control of the COVID-19 pandemic. Joining us today, Dr. Susy Hota, Medical Director of Infection Prevention and Control at UHN. Welcome, Dr. Hota.
Thanks for having me today.
Dr. Bradley Waters, Executive Vice President of Research at UHN. Welcome, Dr. Waters.
Thanks, nice to be here.
And Dr. Shaf Keshavjee, Surgeon-in-Chief of UHN's Sprott Department of Surgery. Welcome, Dr. Keshavjee.
Thanks for having me, Christian.
As always, my guests and I are in different locations to do our part in practicing physical distancing. Let's start with some of the issues arising from this week's headlines, if we can. First to you, Dr. Hota. We've read a lot about reopening and the easing of restrictions. If it's going to work, the capacity to test and trace who may be infected with the coronavirus has to increase. Can you walk us through how intertwined are these two elements, and how integral are they to managing this pandemic?
I think they're very much connected. If we're going to reopen society, we have to do it slowly and carefully, because the whole idea of imposing the restrictions we put in place was to try to control the spread, and recognizing that we wouldn't necessarily be able to stop the spread entirely. We don't want the healthcare system to get overwhelmed, so we can't care for people who might get infected. And so in trying to conceptualize how we can reopen society and slowly start getting back into our day-to-day business with our new norm, paired with that, we have to have the ability to really rapidly detect new cases of COVID-19 that arise. And beyond that, not just be able to test and detect those cases, but actually do something about it. And that's where the contact tracing, the ability to reach out to all those people who not only have gotten sick from COVID-19 and are confirmed to have it, but they're close contacts who are at risk for getting the infection too, and ask them to stay at home and self-isolate is really critical, so that you don't have an explosive increase in cases that occur when you open up again.
My understanding is that, Dr. Hood, there are countries that have successfully controlled community spread of the virus using this recipe of test, trace, isolate. What's your sense of the kind of test and trace capacity we need to achieve that here in Ontario?
We need quite a vast capacity to do that. It's all very labor intensive, especially the contact tracing and reaching out to contacts. There are systems that you can develop that are more digitally enabled that will help. And I think a lot of societies that have been successful in doing this have really reached out to those kinds of technologies to help. And that's something that we need to be working on as well if we want to get to the scale where you can actually have the impact of being able to trace everybody and have a system in place that doesn't require people making phone calls, at desks and having to reach out to them physically. So that's really, really key. But I also don't want to miss the opportunity to emphasize how important it is just to maintain all the things that we've been trying to get used to doing along the way, which is physical distancing, cleaning our hands really often, making sure that we do things like wear masks or face coverings when you're going to be in a crowded situation where you can't physically distance well, as a source control. So if you are harboring the virus and you don't know about it and could potentially infect others, there's a barrier to actually protect them. And then one that we haven't talked about much, which sounds kind of like a simple thing, but I think is really important, is not touching our faces. And I see a lot of it now with all the mask use. And so I think that's probably our next thing to get used to. I think we're becoming more accustomed to separating ourselves from others and keeping 2 meters distance. The next thing will be try not to adjust your masks and touch your face very often, because that can certainly put you at risk.
So let me put you on the spot. Would you like to see every Ontarian tested?
I don't know that that's necessarily the strategy to use. We have to test broadly, but we have to focus that on where the evidence points us to it being really important. And clearly people who are symptomatic, those who are at high risk in terms of their contacts could be those candidates. Otherwise, one of the problems with doing massive amounts of testing is no test is perfect in terms of its characteristics. So you run the risk of false positive test results, kind of chasing your tail after, events that really aren't of consequence. as well as some false negatives. And so it becomes more and more difficult. But the false positive issue is really important as the amount of COVID out there in the community decreases over time. Your risk of having these false positives increase.
Let's bring in Dr. Waters of UHN Research. When we last spoke several weeks ago, the status of all our existing research at UHN and over 1,000 researchers was pretty uncertain. Bring us up to date if you can on that front.
Sure, thanks, Christian. So as you said, we've been extremely busy on a couple of different fronts. And, one of the big tough things that we've had to deal with is the suspension of a large amount of our research. And just like all other parts of society and businesses, we had to close down and suspend much of our on-site research activity. And that involved, we have over 5,000 researchers at UHN. That involved at least 80% of those. We're in the process of restart at the moment, and over the last couple of weeks have been very busy at getting ready and preparing for that restart. We're aiming to begin that process of bringing people back on Monday. So for the last couple of weeks, that preparation has been underway. Some of the changes to our physical space, putting in more stations for hand sanitizers and signage, and setting up our space in order to be able to conduct research under an environment of physical distancing and so on. And that's all ready to go. And we're really excited about kind of turning the machine back on. We recognize it's going to be a very different environment for a long period. So this isn't the end of the suspension and back to normal. It's really an establishment of what will be a new normal. And just as the hospital has to think about how to turn elective activity back on, we're doing that as well, fully expecting that we're going to be living with this virus over the next year. And so part of what we're doing is bringing the staff back at a much reduced density. Our phase one of this approach is a maximum of 25% of normal density. And that's to enable us to be able to practice that physical distancing.
And staying with the theme of reopening, I want to bring in Dr. Keshavjee, because you sit on the province's Surgical Planning and Procedural Committee, where you're part of the group examining the processes for the resumption of surgeries and treatments. Now, thousands of UHN patients and families have had those procedures put on hold because of COVID-19. So where are you at today with your reopening plan?
So when we started out at the heat of the pandemic and actually not knowing what the magnitude of the hit we would take in Toronto and in Ontario, we prepared quite aggressively, and right after March 15th, cut down surgery to about 30% of our total activity, which meant just urgent and emergent cases. So, patients that needed surgery got the surgery they needed, whether it was cardiac or cancer or transplants, but at a much lower level. And then what we've been looking at is how do we ramp back up again at UHN and across the province. At UHN alone, we have over 4,000 patients whose surgery has been postponed. And so according to the plan that we developed at the provincial level, we're looking at what does it take to open slowly in a measured way, but get to the delivering the care. So it means making sure you've got the operating rooms. We have that. The staff, that's a challenge because our staff has been deployed to other places in the hospital to help out. And now we need to be pulling them back to the operating rooms and backfilling in those areas if they're still needed. Equipment, PPE, that was a big challenge. I think slowing down surgery helped us a lot in terms of preserving PPE and developing PPE rules with Dr. Hota's group advisement with IPAC, how to protect our patients, how to protect our staff so that we could perform surgery safely. And also, certain drugs have stressed this delivery system pipeline. So we have to make sure we have enough drugs. And then finally, beds, COVID readiness to deal with what's in our population, should we have a second wave or not. But thankfully, knowing what the first wave was and where we're at, we don't need to have as much of our hospital preserved for COVID readiness, but we still need to have that.
And my understanding, Dr. Keshavjee, is really for the next, who knows how long, year, 2 years, you will continually be faced with this balance, right, of reopening, ramping up, and the necessity to maintain capacity for another COVID surge. So I'm wondering, though, for people out there who have been waiting, do you have any sense, though, of timelines?
Yeah, I think, if we can continue to open up the way we have started and continue throughout the summer, we would need to increase our capacity a little bit more. But I would say by the late fall, like September, October, we should be able to get to the point where we're getting all of our urgent surgeries done within the guideline times. Now, the elective or the scheduled surgeries that are not as time sensitive are going to be a bit more of a problem. And there's just no way to say it in any other way that they're going to be delayed longer. I think one of the challenges is we are going to have to increase to above 100% of standard activity to catch up. It's simple math. So I don't think the ministry and everybody has figured that out yet. And even if we are funded to do that, it's going to mean, what do we do with our staff who've been working so hard, so stressed, and doing extra shifts and so on, and then saying, and by the way, we want to run surgery 6 days a week or 7 days a week to catch up.
It really is a delicate balance. Dr. Hota, before we leave reopening, there was one other question I wanted to ask about this with regard to managing pandemic in terms of the easing of restrictions. We've heard some experts saying we need a more regionalized public health approach that's tailored to a particular area, especially when you see the GTA has the majority of COVID cases. It's a national hotspot versus, say, Kingston, where there have been little to no cases for the last several days. What's your take on the feasibility of something like that?
I think that's a very valid point. If there's an area that's not facing higher COVID activities, then it makes a lot of sense for them to be trying to slowly go back to the increasing of activities, especially within healthcare, where there's already backlogs that have been forming. I mean, we need to think about this in sort of a greater, sort of what's a greater good, and how do you improve on the quality of what we're doing, and look out for patient safety on a broader level, not just, like we should all be lockstep about it. Let's think about what we could do to help people in the interim. So I think that there's a lot of value in looking at it regionally. And I think it's just a matter of everyone having a way of quickly, identifying when you might need to slow down again, if some things are starting to change. So really understanding your local epidemiology.
That's great. Thank you. Dr. Waters, let's move into COVID research, because this is kind of the exciting part of what I was looking forward to today in terms of what's going on at UHN. We have apparently up to nearly 70 COVID-related studies ongoing involving hundreds of principal investigators and lab staff. Probably one of the biggest stories this week involved a drug that I know we have a trial ongoing, which is the hydroxychloroquine. I hope I pronounced that right. The drug that U.S. President Donald Trump claimed he was taking to help prevent COVID infection. But the World Health Organization suspended a study because of early results showing patients who took the drug were at an increased risk of dying. How has this suspension affected the UHN-led HEROES research into hydroxychloroquine?
Yeah, so the trial that you're referring to, the WHO trial, when COVID became a problem for society, the first approach was to look at what potentially existing agents we might have that would be effective. And this is a new virus, it's a new disease, and typically, for new diseases, it takes a long time to understand the nature of the disease, to develop specific therapies, to test them, and then and eventually get them into the clinic. The repurposing of existing agents is another approach, and that's what the WHO took. So they have what's called an adaptive design. This allows them to test a variety of different kinds of agents that potentially might be effective. And one of those agents was hydroxychloroquine. That was one of the very first part of that trial. And there were actually a lot of trials that got studied, that got started across the world. There were some very early results on small numbers published that got people excited, including the President of the United States. But what we've started to learn through the use of this drug and the application is that it isn't very effective in patients, particularly if they have advanced disease. And the WHO, on the basis of the information that has started to come out of these clinical studies and some of the clinical research, has made a decision to drop that arm of the trial and to move on to others. In part both because of a lack of effectiveness and also because in the way that this drug was being given at the doses they were being given, and also in combination with other agents, was also creating some toxicity, particularly in vulnerable patients and cardiovascular compromised patients. So the study that is going at UHN is quite different. This is a study led by Kevin Kane and Megan Landis. And it's using hydroxychloroquine, which is an approved drug for malaria and lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and others. Lots of people take this drug to test its potential as a prophylactic. In other words, in order to prevent infection. And the way that this study has been administered here and at many other sites in Canada now is to look at whether it would prevent infection in emergency department and ICU staff. So that's ongoing. There are a few other studies around the world that are also exploring its ability to prevent development of disease in patients that feel they may have been exposed. And we need to wait for the results of those studies to know if that's going to work. Obviously, the poor results in therapeutic trials are disappointing, but we need to, this is what research is about. It's what science does, is it answers those questions.
Absolutely. I want to drill down into another study called RESPECT, which is trying to determine how common asymptomatic COVID infection is among healthcare workers. What's happening with that trial?
Yeah, and you asked this question earlier around testing and who should be tested and how often should people be tested, and those are great questions. And ideally, the answers to those questions should be based on science and our understanding both of the risk that people asymptomatic carriers or pre-symptomatic carriers might pose, and also what that prevalence is. And we don't have a good picture of that, and particularly in the kinds of populations inside the hospital that are at increased risk of infection because they're dealing with patients that have COVID. So the RESPECT study was launched to test specifically in asymptomatic individuals. And in our case at UHN, it was our healthcare workers. And so testing was offered as a voluntary test that anyone in the hospital could take. And it was led by Dr. Dipali Kumar and supported by Atul Kumar in the transplant department. They were certainly interested in their staff in the transplant department because they deal with patients with compromised immune systems. And they would like to know if anyone with asymptomatic infection would be present in their department. So the trial has been extremely popular, as you might guess. Lots of our staff want to take this test or feel that they would like to know that. And the results of that aren't published yet, but what Dr. What Dipali mentioned to me is that the overall prevalence rate has been extremely low. They've tested now 3,000 individuals, and they've only identified those that showed positive infection in, I think, 6 individuals across that entire group. And what this demonstrates, I think, for us is that we do have a safe work environment, and Dr. Hota and her team and all the infection prevention and control that's been put into place has been effective. There's still lots of anxiety and ongoing anxiety, but I think studies like this will help to put some of that at rest. And I think, going forward, and as you said, as the hospitals and provinces and countries need to make decisions around how often to test and who to test, studies like this are going to help guide that.
That's fantastic. One more I want to squeeze in, if I can, with you, Dr. Waters. Another study with an antiviral drug called interferon. Apparently, it's being treated to speed up the recovery of COVID-infected patients. And I understand that's also showing early promise.
Yeah, so interferons are molecules that can work on what we call the innate side of the immune system. So when we talk about immunity, we're usually thinking of antibodies and long-term protection that our adaptive immune systems create. This is how a vaccine works. But our innate immune system can also be effective, particularly at early stages of the infection, to prevent further infection and to prevent further development of the disease. And so Eleanor Fish, who's one of our longtime immunologists here at UHN, has been very active. Was actually very active in the SARS epidemic in 2003. And in that, during the SARS infection, she demonstrated that interferon alpha could help slow the progression of that disease and accelerate recovery. And so, she's worked in many kinds of infectious diseases, worked in Ebola, you also used interferons there. And when COVID started, she got a study started very quickly, working with scientists in Wuhan, where the outbreak initially happened. So one of the very first therapeutic studies, using interferon alpha, and demonstrated, in fact, that it did accelerate the recovery of individuals that were infected there. That was published recently. There was a write-up in the Globe and Mail that you might have seen. And what we're doing now is a new study. This is being led by Dr. Jordan Feld. He's using interferon lambda, which is a different kind of interferon, which is a bit better tolerated, has less side effects. And he's using a pegylated version of this. It has better properties for distribution. And the target group here is those mild cases, those early cases, so that not the people landing in the emergency department in the ICU, but the individuals that may be sent home and can participate in this study now to, again, either prevent them from getting worse or accelerate their recovery. So that trial's just launched. We're very, very excited about that trial. It's being given in the ambulatory phase, which means patients who are at home will come in and be administered the drug. And we had to set up a special site for these patients to come in. These are COVID positive patients, and we don't want them walking into the front doors of the hospitals, but we've got that set up. And that trial is now has just been approved and is underway.
There's so much going on. I want to bring Dr. Keshavjee, because you're on the front lines of COVID research as a principal investigator with a study of a new diagnostic lung test to help identify COVID patients at the greatest risk. Can you talk to us about your study, Dr. Keshavjee?
Yeah, so as Brad said, in the early phase of the infection, you have the innate immune response to the virus. So as most people know, the vast majority of people that get a viral infection are just fine. They get better and recover from it. But very few people get very, very sick. And the problem with the overwhelming burden on our healthcare system is that in the emergency department, it's hard to predict accurately who's going to get sick and should be admitted for observation or ICU care, and who could just go home and recover and self-isolate. So in work that I've done before, where we were looking at lungs for transplantation, we developed a test that could tell you if the lung had inflammation in it or not. And we found that these are the same tests, the same cytokines, inflammatory markers that are in early ARDS, which is the serious lung injury you see in COVID. And what we've got is a test that you can get an answer in 40 minutes of is this patient having a very strong negative response to the virus, or are they okay? And if they're okay, you can send them home. And the fact that we can get it in 40 minutes would be a big help to the healthcare system. And the other part of it is, if you see the strong inflammatory response, that's where the drugs like the interferon that Brad just mentioned, or the anti-IL-6 drugs and everything, could be given to the patients in a targeted way. If you have a very strong IL-6 response, it's been shown that the anti-IL-6 drugs could be helpful, and we're studying that too.
Can I ask, what are you seeing so far in terms of the diagnostic test?
Yeah, actually, the first aim of our study has been partly achieved for us, both in Singapore and Wuhan in Germany, because what they showed is that if your IL-6 level is high, you were going to end up in the ICU. And so that was aim number one of our study. The only thing is they only found that a day or two later, because that's the state of the art of testing. So now we're just need to validate that our 40-minute test is doing the same thing, which it appears to be.
And did I read correct? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the study's not finished yet, so we
of course, yeah.
answer.
No, I know, I'm sort of putting you on the spot there. Have I read correctly also that you're trying to reduce the length of the actual diagnostic?
Yeah, I mean, that was the big part because, all of, modern personalized medicine that we develop for cancer and everything, if you get your test done and your gene array done, and the next day they say this is the kind of cancer you've got, and this is the treatment, getting the answer the next day is fine. But in transplantation, we need the answer in minutes. So really, a big part of our work is how can we get that reaction time, that time to test result, down to minutes.
It's fantastic. Actually, Dr. Wires, I want to go back to you, if you don't mind. In terms of UHN research as a whole, how does it fit into the global race to produce a vaccine?
Yeah, so there are a lot of new efforts to develop a vaccine. I think I saw a publication last week saying there are over 100 different efforts around the world globally to develop a vaccine. There are coordination activities going on across countries, and Canada's participating in this. And what we think that we're going to need is probably 6 or 7 or 8 of these candidates that move forward into testing, and likely even 2 or 3 of these that will be part of an eventual solution. There are many different approaches that are being taken using inactivated viruses or viral proteins or even RNA delivered antigens. Several of these programs are active in Canada at the moment, either through collaboration or through individual academic and company-driven approaches in Canada. Here at UHN, we are participating in a Canadian-led approach. Dr. Tak Mak, who's one of our famous immunologists in the cancer program, is part of this program. He's building actually a mouse model for the virus that can be used to study infection and also study the ability of vaccines to prevent that infection. And you need very good models to be able to put weight behind the best vaccine candidates. One of the big challenges to being able to create and deliver a vaccine is really around the manufacture and the delivery of the vaccine after we know it's effective. And so what governments need to do is actually to make some bets ahead of time on some of these so they can begin those processes before they know how effective they're going to be. That's the only way to really accelerate this. And so we're seeing that happen. It's happening in the US. We expect it also to happen in Canada. But anything we can do to increase the our ability to measure effectiveness, to look at which of these vaccines is going to be effective, will help us a lot in that process. And so some of that work, both the vaccine development itself, but especially the ability to test and model those vaccines, will be happening here at UHN.
There's so much in terms of promising research ongoing here at UHN. In the meantime, I want to get back to the job of managing the spread of the infection, because really that's going to remain job one until any of these vaccines or treatments become successful. So, Dr. Hota, do you mind running us through the sort of the latest on the ABCs of how we should be conducting ourselves, say first when it comes to public gatherings or family gatherings, that kind of thing, because as we know, a lot of controversy over that in the last week in Toronto.
Yeah, well, I think the first message I have is to really follow what public health is actually saying we should be doing. Because, I think as time goes on, people get a little fatigued with having to keep up with these measures, and they try to come up with ways that you can, try to do things safely. But really, we need to be coordinating those kinds of decisions. So that's really, really important. Trying to keep your distance from people in public, or when you're socializing, if you do have a small gathering. And I think at the moment, it's, really no more than 5 people that you really should be having any kind of gathering with. So keeping the 2 meters distance. Here, doing it outdoors rather than indoors, those are important factors, because when you look at where transmission occurs, it tends to be within more confined spaces or closed quarters. So within households where you have a lot of interaction and you're within a home together, or in public transit, those kinds of settings, that's where it's the most common. So that's really, really important. The social distancing, physical distancing is probably the most important thing that we can all do. And when you can't maintain that, just wearing a face covering or a mask If you're not in a medical setting, we do want to try and conserve our personal protective equipment for healthcare workers where we see a concentration of people with COVID infection and really need to have that kind of protection. But even cloth masks are being advocated as a barrier. And depending on how your cloth mask is made and what it's made of, it may actually be, a reasonable barrier compared to as compared to like a medical mask. So you can actually do it in a good way and achieve some kind of protection. And then cleaning your hands really frequently, and especially after touching surfaces. Some of the more recent data suggests that surfaces are maybe less of a driver of infection. So what we call sort of contact transmission is less important than just the respiratory droplets and being exposed to people's respiratory secretions when they're sick, or even before they're sick, and they may still be shedding virus if they are infected. But that said, it's still important to make sure that you clean your hands. You have no idea if somebody who is really sick, was there just before you were. So it's important to make sure that you do that before you get into your home, or you touch, anything that you would eat, or your face, or things like that.
That's
So
great.
a lot of the advice is pretty much the same as what we said all along. It really is about following the advice on, what is actually permitted, and we've got to take it slowly, and being aware that we might have to end up backtracking a little bit if we go too fast.
That's great. Thank you. I think we need to move into our Slido questions that have been piling up here while we've been talking. Thank you for bringing those up. Our first question, there is the concern that COVID can spread via HVAC. I'm guessing that's like furnace systems and venting, that kind of thing inside your house or in condo or apartment buildings. BPI cannot only prevent this, but also the spread of other virus and allergens. Can you address this issue? And also, what has dealing with COVID taught you about limiting or even preventing future pandemic viral spread? I'm guessing, Susy, we would be best to take this one.
Sure. Yeah, I think the most important thing is the ventilation, the quality of the ventilation in a space, because that can definitely have an impact on how long droplets and aerosols and things like that can actually last in the environment, in the air. So really making sure that you have a well-functioning HVAC system is important, especially in places like hospitals or in buildings where you will see people who are sick with COVID. And there may be some technologies that assist with that. But even just meeting your usual hospital standards of the number of air exchanges that you need for fresh air coming into patient rooms is really important. And hospitals should be taking this opportunity to make sure that their hospitals are functioning well with the ventilation systems. The second part of the question is, it's a big one. So what have we learned about limiting or even preventing future pandemics? I'll be honest, I don't believe that there is a way that you can prevent a future pandemic, truly. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. The one thing we can try to do is discourage the sort of close gathering of humans and other animals that can be the origins of these pandemics. So things like wet markets, where we believe this particular virus originated from, can be breeding grounds. 2/3 of pandemic or new emerging infections within the human population have originated from animals. They're zoonotic. So I think that's one thing we can try to do to prevent the jumping of something that has the capacity to infect humans. It's a new virus or organism into humans. But ultimately, I don't know that we can be so audacious to say that we would actually be able to outsmart these organisms. This is something we just have to be prepared for, probably a little bit better. So there are some things we learned about this event that may be able to help us the next time around if it happens again, hopefully not in any of our lifetimes. But things like investing in the systems that you need to deal with it, investing in technologies and systems and research into personal protective equipment and systems design and things like that in healthcare, I think are really important too. And I could probably go on for the rest of the session talking about different ideas, but those are a couple of really important ones that come top to mind.
It's a great question. Actually, gentlemen, either of you want to weigh in on what we've learned or how we can apply this in the future?
Well, it's Brad here. So I think, Susy's right. The biggest learning is around our need to continue to pay attention to infectious disease and to prepare properly for it. That means having the public health measures in place, the resources and funding for public health, and it also means commitment to research so that we're ready and that we have an armamentarium of options and approaches to take place here. And when things are going well, we tend to sort of forget about it. We forget about the importance of public health. It becomes one of the easiest things to cut because it doesn't impact direct activity. We've seen tremendous interest in helping fund research now around COVID-19. Our federal government is doing it. There's international organizations doing it. There's health charities doing it, and there are lots of good philanthropic donors that are stepping up to help do that, and a huge interest in our research community to come to dive into these super important problems, scientifically interesting problems, and so on. So I think our lesson should be, let's not lose focus. Let's not lose the attention that this is Sprott, so that we are in a better position to be prepared the next time. And as Susy said, there will be a next time.
Yeah. All right. Next question. I believe this should probably also go to you, Dr. Hota. How long do the finest particles remain suspended in the air in an enclosed space or on a windy day? 2-meter distancing may not be entirely effective if one walks into another's asymptomatic airspace.
Yeah, so I think the best evidence we have is actually more experimental and less a real life scenario to help us understand how some of the smaller particles that are generated when you have an event that produces aerosols, that's like the really small fine particles that can potentially travel on air currents or be suspended in air. And in those kinds of experimental settings, it looks like these particles can last in the air for up to 3 hours is what we believe. But what does that actually translate to real life is not really clear to me at all. So if you're outdoors on a windy day, a short duration exposure to an aerosol or two or some small fine particles it seems less likely, and certainly the epidemiology, so looking at what the trends are of infections, doesn't really support that as the main way that people are getting infected or an important way that people are getting infected. I do think what we do have to be more aware of is being in closed contact or in more closed spaces with people, and how some individuals may not be showing symptoms but might actually be able to transmit the infection, and that is probably where some of these cases where we don't know where people picked it up probably originated.
Dr. Keshavjee, this, I think, probably should go to you, the next question. What can you tell lung transplant patients who are healthy but have concerns about their increased risk because of their suppressed immune system? For instance, should they be isolated from family members who live at home but are going to be returning to work?
I mean, that's a very difficult question. Certainly patients who are transplant recipients are immunosuppressed and are at increased risk, and the lungs are a specific vulnerable target for this virus. So while some lung transplant patients have got COVID and recovered from it, from the studies we're doing in following transplant patients around the world, the lung transplant patients have been the most vulnerable with the highest mortality from COVID of the transplant recipients. So that's a difficult question. I think you do need to be extremely strict with the social or physical distancing that Dr. Hota mentioned, and then start to think about, well, what's practical? And I think if someone works but not in a high-risk situation, type of job or location, then maybe it's okay, but some version of physical distancing, even within the home if possible, is probably the right way to go for a while. I think one of the things that was alluded to, that the actual prevalence, the number of people walking around with COVID in Ontario is small, and then it varies by region, is helpful to know that encounter may not happen.
Right. This next question, I'm going to actually throw it out to all of you who would ever like to take it on. From Leslie Ann, do you think we here in Ontario will experience a second wave of COVID-19? And if so, when do you think it will occur? Who wants to kick this one off?
Susy.
Yeah,
There's been no pandemic where there hasn't been a second wave, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I do think there's still a very large number of susceptible Ontarians out there who have not been exposed to this virus or infected with it. And so I do feel we are very likely to have a second wave. In fact, we might have a pretty complicated looking curve depending on, how things go when we start to slowly loosen restrictions. It might not look like waves. It might just look like plateauing and then restarting a little bit and plateauing and restarting. So I think we should be prepared for any of it. What I worry the most about is what will come in the fall. So if we're still in that kind of pattern of trying to keep things at a plateau and the fall hits where we have other respiratory viruses as well, I think that can be a very complicated scenario for people and a very difficult time for healthcare as well, to try and understand what's going on and deal with it.
And I think the other part of it is also going to be, we see the results of what we did 2 or 3 weeks ago in the community playing out now, right? So there might be not just a second wave, but multiple waves, but hopefully little waves. Like we're seeing a slight increase in activity in Ontario right now. And we don't know if that's random or if it's related to the Mother's Day and weekend where people started to go out. So we'll have to really keep a close eye on it. And if it starts to get worrisome, back off again.
It's a real delicate dance, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the way that we're preparing is for COVID to be around for, the foreseeable future. So the way the hospital is thinking about coming back and, the way that we're coming back in research, and I think all businesses out there will be planning the same, is that we're going to have to operate in an environment where COVID is there. As Susy said, I mean, there are more new cases of COVID today around the world than there has been almost since the beginning of the pandemic. Over 100,000 cases a day, more than occurred in all of China every day, somewhere around the world. So there's lots and lots of virus out there. This all started with one person, remember, and until we have a vaccine, or it's going to be with us.
It's just really, I think, still, even after 10 weeks, it's just difficult to wrap our heads around it, isn't it?
And you talked about getting surgery going again. Like, we have delayed patients a bit, and we've gotten to the point where we can't delay any longer. And so we really have to change processes in terms of, in the recovery room now, patients would need to be further apart in our usual recovery room where they only spend a little time, but that all has to be changed. But we just have to say we're going to do it differently and get patients treated.
Well, you are the people to come up with the solutions. I know that. Okay, next question. What must secondary schools need to do to protect staff in their department offices and classrooms, as well as students in the halls and classrooms? It's a very different situation to the elementary schools. I'm guessing Dr. Hota, you should take this one on.
Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge, especially after not having seen their friends for a long time. I think, many students are going to be fighting the urge to socialize closely. So the physical distancing for sure. And, whatever cues that can be put in place, stickers, lines, tape markings, whatever, to actually help people, remind them that they have to keep their distance. It's definitely going to be useful in a school setting, but also enhancing the cleaning and disinfection, because there's a lot of common surfaces that people contact, and even things like lockers, where you just have to be on top of that constantly with this virus. The school policies for staying home when sick and how to manage that is going to have to take this all into account. Making sure there's some distant learning that is also provided, so that you can space people out. And I think there are different models that people have talked about, having students come in every other day so you can decrease the volume of people in-house at any given time, and having virtual classes otherwise, as well as really discouraging sharing of items. And that's a bit tough because, especially with the public school system, we do have to rely on sharing learning materials quite a bit. So that will be something big to overcome, and is certainly a cost associated with that. So many different aspects to think about. Oh yes, and of course the washing the hands, which we should all be training kids to do from day one, because that's what helps us adults as well.
Absolutely. I think this is going to be our last question. I'm going to open it up to, I guess this is really appropriate for you, Dr. Waters. From Phyllis Burke, there seems to be a lot more collaboration among hospitals in responding to COVID. Does that occur in research as well?
Yeah, so it's a great question and a good observation. And I think it's something that we definitely see, that I certainly have seen happening. This collaboration is happening not only, it's happening at all levels. It happens within UHN. So we have studies that have participants from all parts of our different hospitals, from cancer, from neuroscience, from cardiovascular disease. We've seen those individuals develop an interest in infectious disease because of what's going on, but it's also brought them together and made them aware of their other colleagues in those areas and brought new collaborations together. This same thing has happened across hospitals, and in Toronto, what we call the TASM community, which is the affiliated hospitals with the University of Toronto, have come very close together. We've actually signed a new agreement together that allows us to share data and share material with each other in a very simple way that there were sometimes barriers to in the past. And we've seen the community across the world also come together in much the same way. One good example is that there are centers all over the world contributing samples of the virus from patients that are being genetically sequenced to track the evolution and subtle changes in the virus. And this allows a kind of a molecular or genetic way to do epidemiology, to watch, where infections are moving and how they're moving around the world. And this is all happening in real time. It's happening through open sharing of data. And I also read last week, I think there are over 8,000 publications now that have been made available. They're actually ahead of publication, but these are manuscripts. These are findings from individuals that have been put on what are called preprint servers. So they've been made available ahead of time. Creates some confusion sometimes with the press because they pick them up, and sometimes these are early stories or incomplete stories or not properly evaluated. But it's a good thing, and it represents an opening up and sharing and collaboration on this approach.
Thank you. And if there's a silver lining in this kind of collaboration, especially in the medical world, is really encouraging. And this has brought us to the end of our time. It went by really quickly, and I want to thank all of you at home. It was so nice to have you join us for this discussion, and a real big thank to our guest today, Dr. Susy Hota, Medical Director of Infection Prevention and Control at UHN. Thank you.
Thank you again. Dr.
Bradley Waters, Executive Vice President of Research at UHN. Thanks you.
Thanks, Christian.
And Dr. Shaf Keshavjee, Surgeon-in-Chief of UHN Sprott Department of Surgery. Thank you.
Thank you.
This live stream will, of course, be up on the Foundation website, on the YouTube page. For people who are interested out there in donating supplies or support items for our frontline workers, you can email COVID support, that's COVID support, all one word, at uhn.ca, and someone at the Foundation will be very glad to help you out. And as always, donor support is critical to the work we do here at UHN. Right now, our people need your support more than ever, especially on the front lines in terms of equipping our staff and in terms of research, people behind the scenes racing to find treatments and vaccines. So if you're able to help, we ask you to consider making a donation. Visit tgwhf.ca/help now. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Keep practicing physical distancing and stay safe.